Hello and welcome to today's BAPT in Conversation webinar. We've got Mary McGuiness here from Australia joining me 11 hours time difference. She's in the early morning at 7 a.m. I'm 8 p.m. here in the UK. But that's the magic of the internet. We're going to connect across the world and have a chat about type. It's one of the things that's brought us together here today. So welcome, thanks for everyone for joining us. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Mary. So she's one of Australia's most experienced type practitioners. She's been a big part of the AusAPT, the APT in Australia for psychological type. Has been over here to the UK. We just talked about that. She's been to Greenwich conference here at least once. She runs founding director of the Institute for Type Development over in Australia. She's for many years been training people in psychological type instruments and running workshops with people to help them just explore their type. She's got an academic background in psychology and education. She's an author as well. We're going to talk about all these things today. So welcome, Mary. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. Nice and early in the morning on what's going to be a very hot day here today.
Yeah, you've got the sun right. We're in the middle of the midst of winter, so
right. Well, the sun's already up and shining through the window. So they're saying about 28 or 29 degrees today in Sydney. So that's Celsius, which is not the hottest weather we get here, but it's hot. Yeah,
it's pretty hot. So in Australia, there at the minute, I mean, you're in the end like us of the COVID pandemic era. Is it quite quiet there on the streets? So how's it going at the minute?
Fairly quiet. We're not in lockdown at the moment, but some businesses have sort of shut down or slowed down because a lot of the workers are getting sick. We've had, just in the last couple of weeks, we've had a bit of difficulty with supply of chickens, for example, because our biggest chicken producer, they said they've lost a lot of their staff because they're homesick, with COVID, and they haven't got enough staff packing the meat, to get it to the supermarkets. So that's a bit of a problem, and our hospitals have been a little bit overwhelmed just recently because a lot more people going into hospital than there were before.
Wow. This has huge impacts globally. It's interesting to hear from over there what's happening. So this is an unprecedented thing. So you, like a lot of people, have you been adapting to like online delivery of things and workshops?
Yes, well, in 2020, I think I went into shock for about 6 months when the pandemic hit, because we were sort of semi-lockdown. It wasn't a hard lockdown, but we were told to stay home if we could. And so for the first 6 months, I didn't do any training at all, basically, because I had never done online training before. And I didn't even like doing it myself as a client, But by the way, my type is ENFP, so I'm much more at home in a room with a whole lot of people. And but anyway, by the time we got to August, I thought, well, it's about time to do something. So I set up Zoom and started running the certification program via Zoom, plus a couple of other programs, and it went really well. I was quite surprised how people received it, and I had to adapt some things, of course. But no, I've been running not as many programs. So I sort of keep hoping that things are going to shift and we'll get back in the classroom. But I think it'll be a while before we do that still.
Today in 2022, obviously you're delivering training for practitioners. Is there sort of good demand for training in that in the Australian business scene?
Yeah, it's been a bit quieter since the pandemic hit, of course, much quieter. The numbers are down considerably on what they were. But I think, people are just staying close to home, and I think sort of in some cases doing as little as possible. I did hear that Australians have apparently been paying off their mortgages at a very high rate. The news just came out the other day that on average, people are about 4 years ahead on their mortgage at the moment because they've been staying home and ploughing their money into that sort of thing, and home renovations have been huge apparently. So it's people have adapted all around, but yeah. So yeah, well, you just got to make the most of sort of the situation you're in.
Tell me a bit more about your background, and how did you originally get into psychological type? From you studying psychology? Where did you find out about it?
It was quite different, actually. I was always interested in people, so I decided to become a school teacher originally, and I worked as particularly maths and science and religious education. And as the years went on, I dabbled in a whole lot of other things too, because I got bored with doing the same stuff all the time. But one of the things I was heavily involved in was like pastoral care of students. And after a few years teaching girls, I went into a boys' high school in Sydney, and it was pretty tough going. They weren't the easiest students to handle, and there were big classes in those days because we had a shortage of science teachers. So 48 year 9 boys in a science laboratory is a real challenge, and so I was trying all sorts of ways to try to motivate them and get them interested just by trial and error. And some years later, I came across type, and once I understood type, I thought, now it makes so much sense, why I found that really hands-on learning was one of the things that really motivated these students, and suddenly I understood why. What happened was I was given the opportunity to go on a 2-week retreat, and in the middle of it there was 3 days on psychological type. Now this was 1981, and prior to that I'd been doing a counselling course for teachers, a part-time thing at night. A lot of teachers in Sydney were doing it just to get some understanding of psychology, and that's where I came across Jung, and I was fascinated by that. But then when I went on this retreat and did 3 days on psychological type, it explained so much about the students I was working with. Plus, I come from a very large extended family, and it explained a lot of the differences within my own family as well. Why certain ones got on better with it, with each other, and other ones sort of congregated together. And I had one brother that everyone thought was strange, and of course once we did type it, we worked out he was an INTP in a family of mostly SJs and SPs, and suddenly it explained to him and made a whole lot of sense. And I suppose similar for me, an ENFP, and there was one INFP, and the rest were all STJs and SFJs and SPs and whatever. And I found that really fascinating, because it did explain a lot of the dynamics in the family. And so after that, I just looked around for any courses I could find on type and Myers-Briggs and all that. What was happening in Australia in the late 70s, the Catholic Church, I was working in the Catholic system because we have a huge Catholic education system here. It's massive. But what happened in the late 70s is they realized that a lot of what they call the lay teachers, the non-religious teachers, were better educated than the brothers and nuns and priests. And because many of them only had 1 or 2 years teacher training. So the Catholic Church decided to do a big upgrade, and they started sending them off for postgraduate studies. And some of them went to England, but the majority went to Berkeley College in California and to Loyola University, which was a Catholic university in Chicago. And both of those universities were heavily into Myers-Briggs and temperament theory. In fact, David Keirsey, the temperament expert, worked at Berkeley University at the time. And so all of these religious would go over there for about 3 years, do their degree, come back, and they came back with arms full of Myers-Briggs questionnaires and answer sheets and all that. And they started doing workshops in their religious communities and in their schools with the school staff. And really that's how it spread in Australia. Prior to that, hardly anybody used it. And you know, I'd never heard of it, but it really took off because of that. And then as things happened in the 80s, a lot of the religious left religious life. I think it was a worldwide thing, or in the Western world anyway. There were changes going on in the church, and a lot of them went out into the corporate world and other business ventures, and took the MBTI with them and started doing training in the corporate world. And that's really how it spread in Australia. And so anyway, I was looking around for, after I did the retreat and was exposed to it. It was actually one of the Catholic religious at the retreat was the person who took me through it. And after that, I looked for more and more courses and anything. And there was very little happening in Australia, almost nothing. And but I went to everything I could find. And one day, one of the courses that was run by Maris brother, he had a little stack of these magazines called The Type Reporter. There was a lady in America called Sue Scanlon who used to get people who are sort of experts in type in a particular field, and she'd get them to write articles for this little magazine and publish them every, I think it was a month or 2 months. And she did that for about 20 years. And but in the Type Reporter was this tiny little advertisement that said, you know, become accredited to use the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It was this little ad, and it was Margaret and Gary Hartzler in the United States. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I wasn't seriously thinking about packing up and going to the United States for a week to do a course. I didn't do those sort of things back then. But I was curious, so I wrote them a letter, which, you know, this is the days before emails, and wrote them a letter and said, oh, tell me about this course you're running. And anyway, 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from Gary. He said, don't come over here. Get a group of people together and we'll come over there because we'd love to come to Australia. So I started letting people know to see if there was any interest, and had a religious brother that had run the course that I had attended, and he helped advertise it as well. We ended up with 45 people because some of them were actually people who were already using type. Who, as I said, had been overseas studying, but there wasn't a formal program prior to this to accredit people. And so, you know, they wanted to come in and do it. And so a year later, which was January 1986, we had this program in Sydney, and it was 6 days residential. So it was just mind-blowing. You know, we just, you know, we had type for breakfast, lunch and dinner because we're all together for that time. And it was Margaret and Gary Hartzler, and Catherine Myers came as well. Catherine was the daughter-in-law of Isabel Myers. She married Peter Myers, and she'd just turned 60. She had been involved in the very first high school class that Isabel Myers ever worked on, which was Peter's class. She was in the same class as Peter Myers. And so she'd been involved with type for years, you know, and decades. And I remember at the end of the course, she said, oh, Mary, I can't believe how much I've learnt this week. And I thought, wow, after all that time, you're still learning, you know. And it's true, you know, you never stop learning. There's always more insights to get because you're working with different people all the time. But the course went really, really well. It was just fabulous. And at the end of it, you know, the day after, we were sitting around at my home actually having lunch, and they said, well, that went so well, why don't you do it again? I thought, oh, well, I suppose we could. So you know, I didn't have any plans of setting up a business. I was working full-time as a school teacher at the time. And so I said, oh, yeah, okay, well, we'll do it. So we sort of advertised again and ran another course before the end of the year and got Margaret and Gary to come out again. And we just kept doing it, basically. And after a couple of years, they said, well, you know, why don't we offer something for the graduates? You've got a couple of hundred graduates now. And then Gary said, well, you know, why don't you, I used to they would come out and bring books with them. There weren't many books in those days, by the way. You could count them on one hand initially, but as more books were written, they would bring them out and sell them at the workshop, and then I'd buy up whatever was left and sell them to people. And so they sort of said, well, you really ought to start thinking about getting more books, and so you've got business going when we're not here. So I did all that, but like there was no business plan. It was just, I just loved working with type. And so any suggestion that came up that sounded good, I just kept doing it basically. And as fate would have it, during that year, I became pregnant with my first child, and she was born in December, the end of December, 1986. And she had Down syndrome. And so I had arranged to take maternity leave for 6 months. So I had to decide what I was going to do. And I thought, well, she really needs me at home. So I resigned from my job. And but we still kept running these workshops. And during that year, 1986, I was working as a consultant for the Catholic Education Office as well, going around to schools. And when they heard that I could do the type stuff, the schools would ring up and say, Mary, come and do this with my staff. And so I went into a number of schools during that year. So once I resigned, the schools kept ringing up. In fact, they rang up for 20 years, and I was constantly going into schools, working with the school staffs. So, in between looking after this little child, and then 2 years later, another one, in between doing that and running, 1 or 2 accreditation programs during the year with the Hartzlers, I was going out into schools and running staff development days and whatever, and which was great. Gave me an excuse to get out of the house and have a bit of a break from parenting. And so that's really how it all started. It was there was no business plan ever. There's still no business plan actually, but it was just sort of doing what following my intuition, I guess.
Wonderful. Yeah, the story of extroverted intuition, like an emergent journey.
Yeah. So when we got to the peak, like around 2000, we were running, and after that, we were running about 20 courses a year in Australia, and between 15 and 30 people on each one. So we were training a lot of people.
You work in schools. To what degree did schools as a whole in Australia embrace, help using type as a model to help children and teachers, or was it just more focused on your local area where you were working? Did people go out as well?
Well, I was mostly working with schools around Sydney and sort of within driving distance of Sydney. Although I went up to Darwin a couple of times and worked in schools up there. Initially, it was very heavily in Catholic schools because of the influence of the Catholic religious, and then it spread to some of the other private schools like Anglican schools and that. But then I ended up in the public school system as well, running workshops for not only for teachers but sometimes for administrative staff as well. And sometimes for school principals. I got invited to several principals conferences, and I would present, not a whole workshop necessarily, but present like a 1.5 hour session on type to introduce them to psychological type. And then sometimes after that, I'd get invited to the school to do a staff development day. We have, the system in Australia is that most schools have at least one day every term, which is like 4 times a year, where they do some sort of staff development where the children are not there. And it's more for the staff. And so a lot of schools, I've probably worked in about 400 schools at different times. Some of them I went back several years later when they had new staff and worked in the same school again. But yeah, the schools were very, very keen. A few times I went into universities with education staff, but the universities were very slow to pick it up, because they had their own psychological theories that they followed, and if they went into Jung, then they were very suspicious. We got a bit of criticism in the early days from some of the universities, because they didn't see it as serious psychological material. But then years later, they started criticizing and saying, why are these non-psychologists using our material, our theories? Because you don't have to be a psychologist to be trained in this. And that was the way Isabel wanted it. She wanted it available to non-psychologists as well. So,
what impact did you see then, on teachers working in schools once they learned about type, and how did it affect the way they worked and behaved?
It was massive. The number of times that teachers said to me, why didn't somebody teach me this 20 years ago? Like all the heartache you go through as a teacher, trying to find ways to motivate students and trying to help students who were struggling, because I have a belief that every child wants to learn. They don't always want to learn what teachers want them to learn, or the way teachers want them to learn. And it's a matter of finding how to work with them. But I had no idea. I can remember it when I was training as a teacher and doing essays on how children were different from each other, and we had to adapt to these differences and whatever. But nobody ever got very specific about what exactly were these differences, apart from gender differences, And what type gave us was a very specific way of saying, hey, if you've got these sensing kids and intuitive kids, they're going to learn very differently. And so, you better make sure that you adapt your teaching to cater for both. And I'll give you one example. There was a primary school I went to where this was a year 5 or 6, year 5 class, I think, sort of about 10 years old, these kids. And I went to work with the staff, and they were talking about this particular class and what a problem class they had been since kindergarten, which I found a little bit off-putting. I thought, fancy being labelled in kindergarten as a problem class, and here they were 5 years and they were still a problem class. And when the more they talked about them, the more I thought, these are just really bubbly, extroverted, very active kids. And anyway, the teacher asked me to do some work with her to help look at how to do things differently. And so one of the things that she did, she used to get them to do project work. So for an hour a day, they'd work on this project in groups. And so we looked at, it was actually Gordon Lawrence's book, People Types and Tiger Stripes. And there's a little questionnaire in there. And we used that to divide the students into 4 different groups. And she organised, during that project time, they would sit in their groups. And she had a list of projects, which were standard ones that she did each year, and 4 very, very different projects. And so she gave them to the kids and said, pick which one you want. And each group picked a totally different project. And she said normally they scramble and quarrel about who's going to do whatever topic, but they chose something very different. Like the SP group chose the one where they had to build a model of a medieval village, and like it just made so much sense to me. So anyway, she was going to do this for 6 weeks. Well, she ended up doing this kind of project work in these ended up in temperament groups, and she ended up doing it from about May to October. Every day they did this, and the principal told me towards the end of the year, she said, I can't believe the difference in this class. And she said, before the teacher arrives in the morning, they're lined up outside the room waiting for her to get there. And so total switch, because she was teaching them in a way that made sense to them, and that help them to learn. And I think that's the big thing. It's about looking at how do we help children to learn. I used to say this to my science teachers, it's not good enough for you to be a good teacher. You have to make sure the students learn. If they're not learning, you're not teaching. And type gives you a way of understanding how they learn and how you can adapt. You only have to make very often very small changes to reach those students that are having trouble. So,
did you find, which types of students did you find would struggle the most in your experience in the Australian system of the time?
Well, SP students mostly, and particularly extroverted SPs, ESFPs and ESTPs often. The ISTPs and ISFPs, if they were bored, they'd read the racing form under the desk or something like that. They would find some way to entertain themselves quietly. But the extroverted ones would do something to act out a little bit and get themselves into trouble. And there were some other types too. Sometimes ENTPs and INTPs sometimes would get into trouble if they were bored because they weren't being challenged enough, and so they would end up sort of arguing with teachers and being difficult that way. So and once teachers understand that these children need to be motivated, and they needed to be treated in a way that caters for their needs as well. And that's why I use temperament theory a little bit as well, because the core needs of the temperament theory are really, I think, really essential, and they give teachers such an insight. The fact that SPs need action, they need activity, hands-on activity, they need to be in the moment, not just reading from a textbook, that sort of thing. And whereas NTs need to be challenged intellectually and sort of beyond perhaps much of the rest of the class. I remember one teacher who worked with children at risk in the public system over here, and she used to go around to schools where they had a child that was not thriving, that had just given up, and this is in primary school, by the way. And what she found was she started typing them, and she found that some of the INTPs had tuned out of school by year 2. Now that's age 6 or 7. And once she typed them and could see what they needed and was able to say to the teacher, this is what this child needs, amazing shifts happen. And she gave one example of a little boy who was actually an ENTJ, and he was about 10 years old, and the teacher said he was just a troublemaker. She didn't want him in the class, and it was very difficult to handle. And she said, well, these students, these ENTJs usually like to be in charge of something, sort of to organize something, and they're really good organizers. Can you give him something to organize? And she said, oh, I wouldn't trust him to organize anything. And she said, trust me. She said, well, I've got this box of books over there in a little bookshelf, and I was going to set up a lending library just within my own class for these books. And she said, give it to him and let him do it. And so she reluctantly gave him the books and said, set up a system so students in this class can borrow the books. It took him 2 days. He had every book catalogued according to the Dewey system, and had a lending system in operation, and he was never a problem again, because he was doing something that made him use his talents and his gifts and made him feel important, and he didn't need to argue with the teacher anymore. So, it's just little things like that just make such a difference. And it's but a number of times I've had teachers say that it changed their approach to teaching. They didn't have to change their teaching method a lot, but sometimes they made some adaptations to include a lot more practical activity or some challenging questions for the students that needed that.
It's amazing hearing you talk about the impact and what you've seen, and this makes me wonder, to what level did this get captured and researched and catalogued so that it could, be used as evidence to show the impact of the work?
Oh, there's a huge amount of research on education. Isabel Myers was an educator, and she did a lot of research, and Catherine Myers also, and Margaret Hartzell, of course. Margaret Hartzell was a school teacher, and all of her work was in education, and her research was in education as well. Where you'll find a lot of it is in the old manual, the 1986 manual, I think it was, because when they revamped the Myers-Briggs in the 1990s, once you revamp an instrument, you can't put in the research from the previous instrument. You have to only put in the research from the current instrument into the manual. Well, the 1986 manual has hundreds of research studies that it refers to, and a lot of them are in education. So if people want to get hold of that, you'll see lots of studies. The other place, if people are really interested in finding out, is the Center for the Applications of Psychological Type in Florida is the research center that was set up by Mary McCauley, and Isabel Myers was involved with it. They worked a lot together in Isabel's later years, and they gather research from all around the world. So if anyone is really interested, they can contact them and ask them, what have you got on such and such a topic? And they will tell them, and there's heaps on education, heaps of evidence out there. And they'll email you abstracts of different studies that they've got. And then years ago, I got some material from them. I got a whole stack in the days when they used to print it off for you and send it to you, like $28. And they sent it across the Pacific Ocean, this great stack of research articles that was on policing at the time. But these days it would all be done electronically. So, and there are a few books around. Gordon Lawrence's books are very good. There's another one called Effective Teaching. Other smaller books around. So, but there is a lot of evidence.
Aware that Jane Kesey over in education.
That's right. Yeah, Jane more recently. Yeah, Jane has been involved very heavily in education too. So, sort of, yeah, that's been a very strong focus from the beginning because Isabel was interested in education.
Well, it's incredible, you know, if it's making that huge difference and making children feel understood and validated and
yeah, and it takes away the need to blame students. This is the big thing, because very often teachers will say, oh, that's just a naughty child, or that's a naughty class. And they're not being naughty. Very often they're just being themselves. You know, they're just being who they are. And sometimes they don't even realize that what they're doing might be inappropriate in a classroom. And so.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about your books now. I'm just going to hold this one up. You've got Personality. So that was 2004. You published that. And you're just saying that around that same time, in a few years, you published several books. And also questions and answers on psychological types. Is that another one? And a children's version.
And then the children's book looks like that. And it has a sort of an inbuilt questionnaire, and it's meant for children in primary school age, you know, sort of around about roughly 7 to 11. And it starts off by a whole lot of questions about their hobbies, their heroes, some differences in people they know. What do your parents say about you? What do your friends say about you? And then it gets onto these little sort of like questionnaires. And so they come up with their own personality type. And then it gives a little bit of a rundown about what helps me to learn. So for each of the types, you know, what can teachers do to help that child to learn? And then it gives a little bit of a description of the types. And there's some information at the back for teachers and parents to sort of say, you know, this is what you can do to help this particular child. With the Yellow Book, how that came about is the program that Margaret and Gary Hartzler used for our Myers-Briggs accreditation program in Australia. One of the components of it was that there was a time slot for each of the types. Once we'd been through all the theory and we'd been through the applications, looking at communication and all that sort of thing, then we would have a time slot for each type where the people in the room would teach the group about their own type. So we'd have a time slot for ISTJs and then a time slot for ISFJs, etc. And if it was a 15-minute time slot plus another 10 or 15 minutes for discussion. And so in that time slot, they had to prepare something and come in to present to the rest of the group. You know, this is who I am, or and relate it to type if they could. But if they didn't, then we'd do that in the questioning afterwards. They'd ask questions, or we'd have a discussion. I'd say things like, what did you see in that presentation that fitted with ISTJ? And then we'd have a discussion about it and look at the language and the behaviours and the interests and the career options, whatever it was. And they could focus on anything they wanted in that time. Now, for years and years, I actually videotaped them. giving those talks, because at every workshop we'd have some types missing, and so I'd use the videotapes then in place of it, so every type would get looked at in turn and people would have a chance to ask questions about it. So by the time I got to 2004, I had about 15 years of videotapes, not thousands, but hundreds of hours of videotapes basically. And so what I did around, or just before 2004, I actually sat down and I watched them all. I got all the ISTJs together. I watched them one after the other and wrote down everything they said, and then collated all the information. But what I did do was I tried to keep it in their own words and not change it into my ENFP language. And I learned that from Isabel, because when she was developing the questionnaire, she found that language made a huge difference. She was an INFP and her husband Clarence was an ISTJ. So when she developed the original questions, way back in the 40s, Clarence was the first person she'd take them to, because he was so different from her. And she'd say, Clarence, tell me, which answer would you pick? And it might be a sensing answer and an intuitive answer. And she's hoping he would pick the sensing answer, because he was a sensing type and she was an intuitive. And he would look at the question and he'd say, oh, you've asked the question wrong. And she'd say, well, how should I have asked it? And he would rephrase it in sensing language. And she realized that it wasn't just the content of the question that was important, but the language you use was immensely important. Because at a conscious level, people are answering a question, but at an unconscious level, if all things are equal, they're going to be attracted to the one that's in their language. And so what I did with this was deliberately keep their own language. And I only adjusted it for grammar, and put it in full sentences and that. And I found that worked, because if I get to a point where a person says, well, I'm not sure, I think I could be an INTJ or an INFJ, well, I get them to read at least the first part of the description of both, and they get it just like that, because the language appeals to them. And so that was why it took quite a long time. The first 11 pages of the book were easy. That was just the theory, but the last, the type descriptions took me 2 years to write, because I deliberately did not look at any books. I just took it from the videos and collated. It's just a mountain of work. And I remember when I was getting towards the end, I got down to the last 2 type descriptions, and I was saying to myself, Mary, keep going, don't stop, because you'll never, ever have to do this again in your lifetime. I just had to keep the whip out, because it was just such a big job. It sounds easy, but there was a lot of work in it. And so I've made minor adjustments here and there, but no big adjustments. Not in this lifetime, maybe in the next. So
fascinating to hear the amount of data and research that went into the descriptions. Then that's a lot of work by the sound of it. And
yeah,
I think using type, when you're writing about, you have to multiply your effort by 16 to do it. It's a lot. So
yeah. And the thing is that after a while, it took on a life of its own. Like the original plan of the headings that I was going to cover, it actually changed and developed as I kept looking at what people were saying. I sort of ended up changing it around a little bit and had to go back and revamp the earlier descriptions that I'd already done, because it sort of, things just started to stand out after a while. And it seems to work. I've sold, I lost count when I got to about 140,000. But one of these days I'll update the count and find out what it was. But people like it. It seems to work. It speaks their language. And yep. So
that's a big thing, isn't it? That, I mean, I always wondered in type as a theory and as practitioners, we tend to be, it tends to be created by predominantly more specific types, especially the introverted intuitives and the extroverted intuitives, and a lot of the introverted feeling types as well. There's some types that really seem to be less attracted to type. It's the irony of it that actually type seems to appeal to some types more than others. Do you think that's because of the language we're using? Do you think we could do it better to speak to more people?
Well, type is attractive to intuitives because it's a theory, and particularly to NFs. Like I know with the accreditation program, running that for 22 years, the Myers-Briggs for 22 years, and since then I've been doing the majors personality type inventory. So it's 30 years of running accreditation or certification programs. And the biggest group by far are ENFPs, followed by INFPs and ENTPs and INTPs. But what attracts them is the theory, and for some of them the people content as well. So we've never ever had anywhere near as many SPs, for example. We get a reasonable number of SJs, but not as many SPs, because the thought of sitting in a classroom for 3 or 4 days, learning something that does not appeal to them. They spent years trying to get out of the classroom. Sort of, they don't want to go back unless they really need it for work. When I did these books, almost all of the books on type were written by ENFJs, ENFPs, INTPs, common as well. I don't know if there were any ENTPs, but yeah, mostly NTPs or NFPs and or NFJs, and they will appeal to certain types of people, and I found this when I was presenting type too. In the early days, I'd present something and we'd go to a break and people would come out and say, "Can you give me an example of that?" And I realized very early on that particularly for the sensing people, they want to see a practical example. And it's that practical side that's really important, that gets the message through to them. So that was why, I started incorporating a lot more practical material and sensing kind of material into my training as well.
Let's talk about type development, because I mean, that's the name of your business, the organization, Institute for Type Development, and it's a large part of your descriptions in your book as well. You've got a whole section on, well, you're not very clear, on this side here, each type has a kind of developmental journey. You're talking about when the different functions become more conscious or develops. So we sort of laugh about how sort of a lot of SPs typically gravitate to being a certain way and don't want to be in the classroom. But as you've described it here, the people can develop and almost become their opposites in a way, or embrace their opposites. So tell me a bit about how you've seen the importance of that development path.
I think if you're working with anyone who's well and truly into their adult journey, then I think it's important, because they're experiencing changes, particularly sometimes in their 20s, but certainly from middle 30s onwards, there are a lot of changes happening. And people will often say to me, "Oh, like I used to be an INFJ, but now I'm an INTJ," because they can see the thinking developing in them, or sometimes it was the reverse. And I would have to sort of explain to them, "Hey, maybe you haven't changed your personality type, you've just developed a bit of the other side." And so what you're getting is a bit more balance in the personality. And I realized that was important to people to help understand the journey that they'd been on. It didn't matter so much to the 21-year-old, but as people got older, they could look back and say, "Yeah, I have changed. I can see that." And so when I'm working with people, I'll often say to them, "What were you like as a child? Or what were you like as an adolescent?" So go back there. If you're not sure, go back and have a look at that, because that's probably more likely to be your true type, particularly if you're in a home where you were encouraged to be yourself and allowed to be yourself. Then what was going on back then was probably more the true type. And so I find this is very useful. So usually what I do with people is I'll take them through the basics of the theory, get them to self-select as they go along. So we'll talk about extroversion and introversion. Then I'll say, well, which one sounds more like you when you're in your natural state, when you're being yourself? And so they'll pick their preference, and then I'll get them talking about, why do you see yourself as an extrovert, not an introvert, etc. And once we've done all that and we've decided on the type, then I'll get them to read part of the description, usually the first column of that book, and say, does that sound like you? And then we'll discuss that. And then I'll take them through the type development as a way of checking and just giving them that extra information, and say, these are the stages you are likely to have gone through, or that most people of your type go through. And then we'll discuss that to see if it's correct. And I'll give you some examples. I've had people just be absolutely amazed, and they'll say, oh, that explains what's going on. Because very often, if people are coming to see you on a personal level, they're usually 35 years of age or somewhere around there, because they know they can see these changes going on, and they don't know what's happening. And sometimes it can be quite scary, because they think they're sort of losing the plot a little bit, years ago, I had my business in this, what had been an old bank in Lidcombe in Sydney. And so people could walk in off the street. And I had a guy walk in, was an ISTJ, turned out to be an ISTJ. He walked in and said, I hear you do stuff about personality here. I was wondering if you could help me. And so we ended up sitting down, and we went through the questionnaire, we went through the explanation, and I said, and of course his age was 35. And then I sort of took him through the type development stages. Now, 6 months later, I had another guy who was also an electrician, walked through ISTJ, both of them electricians, walked through the door, and the same thing. I don't know if he came from the same place, but when I walked through the type development stage, and they were both 35, both ISTJs, when I got to the fourth stage, I said, now, even though you're a really practical person, when you hit 35, it's likely that this intuitive part of you will start to come to the surface more. You might find yourself getting a little bit vague and forgetting things, where normally you're really good with facts and details. And both of them had exactly the same reaction. They threw themselves back in the chair and said, oh, is that what's wrong with me? And one of them said, I forget things. I've been an electrician since I left school, and I'm sitting there with two wires in my hand. I can't remember which ones I have to connect, and I thought, one guy said, I thought I was getting Alzheimer's, because he was so forgetful. And I realized at the time I had two brothers-in-law who were electricians, and as they got older, they became TAFE teachers. The TAFE is our technical and further education system. They'd gone into the TAFE system to teach electricity, and I wondered whether that was why they found it a bit challenging to be working with it still when this intuitive side was coming, and they were getting a lot more forgetful. And the thing is, it was such a relief for these two guys to realize that what they were going through was perfectly normal. And I said to them, it'll settle down, after a bit of time. Just be really careful with your safety in the meantime, but it'll settle down and it'll take its rightful place, and your sensing will still be your dominant function. But at the moment, the intuition sort of coming to the fore a little bit, and so it's sort of taking over. So, they were really pleased about the insight. And I've had other people, who started off as thinkers, and got to 35 and find themselves getting teary about things, and sort of feeling on the edge of bursting into tears, and it was frightening for them, because that was not their normal way of being. But once they understood it, they could live with it. And as I said, it'll pass. It's just something, because it's come to the surface now, it's sort of demanding a bit of attention, and this is the time when you need to give it some attention. I found it also really useful for couples, because very often people end up in a relationship, a long-term relationship, with somebody who's different from them in some ways. And often it gives them insight into the fact that not only did they marry someone who was different from them, but that person's changing and they're changing. And very often what happens is they change and become a bit more like each other as they get older. And so that was a relief. I had a woman it was a corporate setting many years ago now, and I did this workshop, and it was a team building workshop. And this woman came out to me at the end of it with tears in her eyes, and she said, my marriage broke up 6 years ago. She said, if I had done this, we'd still be together. She said, because we were having trouble and I couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. If I'd understood this, we'd still be together. And I thought, how sad is that, And so it's really about helping people to understand themselves particularly and manage their own life better, but also how to understand that other person they're relating to and see the world a little bit from their point of view. So.
It's wonderful, yeah. No, I think it's great, that what you're saying, I agree with a lot of it, and that, you're really getting that idea that type is a developmental pathway. It's a journey of one-sidedness that, as you described, it can become comfortable, it can become our sense of identity, as the electricians were, they were used to, this is who I am, and suddenly that dissolves at some point sometimes, and we go, oh no, maybe there's more there, what's going on, and it is I think it's important that people understand that process. That
and particularly when you're dealing with the inferior function too, once people understand it, what I've found is that once people understand the inferior function and why it's acting up, they very rarely get out of control again. Because they can see it coming and they understand it, and they can sort of laugh it off and say, oh, I better calm down and not get too uptight about this. Once they know what's going on, very often what happens is they're getting out of control, and that becomes the scary thing. That loss of control and not understanding is what really creates problems for them. But once they understand, it makes such a difference.
Yeah, and it's great, we're seeing, the amount of impact it can have on an individual's life. And it's sad to see, when types criticize that people downplay our experience, the positive experiences that we do have from it. And it seems such a powerful model that the things that we see people benefiting from using it, that there's no way they can possibly be made up. They really do change people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. And what I'm finding now, I have about 30 nieces and nephews, and they're all in their 30s and 40s, and they've got children of their own. And over the years, I've actually taken most of them through the type as well, help them to identify their types, to look at their own relationship. But what I'm finding interesting is that they now look at the children differently, and they'll say, oh yeah, well, Chloe's the introvert and Madeline's an ESFJ, and like they can see the importance of recognizing the difference. Like in one family there are 3 little girls, and the first one's the introvert, next one's a raging extrovert and ESFJ, and the next one not quite sure yet because she's very little, but at one stage they had the first 2 in the bedroom together. And it really was not working. So that what they did was they gave the older girl a bedroom and put the 2 little ones in together, and they're much happier because they want the company, and she's much happier because she needs a bit of space. But to hear the parents talking about that, and they worked it out themselves, that was what would be helpful to those children. This is what I see as the ideal, is that people understand this enough so that they can adjust and cater for each other's needs in a productive way.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we've kind of reached the end of our time today. I think I wanted it to keep going a little bit longer. Was
I'm happy to. But I'm happy if people have got questions, or if you want to know anything else.
we had one comment from Catherine. She said, I don't know if her type preferences are INTP, and she said, having children in my early 30s made me more aware of my feeling side. So that kind of, nurturing parental role in that age as well, that time, I have to bring that out for her. So that's part of that journey of development. It's really interesting to know.
So important. But it can be difficult too, like being a parent and having children who are very different from you can be very stressful if you don't understand the difference. I can remember I have a little ESFP. Well, he's not a little anymore. He's 33 years old now. But when he was very little, ESFP, he just bounced around the room. And he went to church one day with his father, and they came home, and his father was obviously really uptight. And he was a naughty boy in church today, and like he was 3 years old. 3-year-old kids are not naughty; they're just themselves. So I was asking him questions. Were you naughty? No, no. And I could tell, like, he never lied. He was always so honest. And I said to him, eventually I worked out what they were doing. They were sitting in the front row and there was nothing in front of them. There were no kneelers or anything in front of them, no chairs or anything, just 4 feet of beautiful blue carpet and these carpeted stairs up to what looked for all intents and purposes like a stage. And this boy loved to dance around the house, to listen to the Aladdin music. And I said to him, what were you doing when you were out in front? He said, I was dancing. Like, they turned the music on and he started to dance in church, and some woman made a comment, so his father got upset and smacked him, and then another woman made a comment about him smacking the child, and the poor child didn't have a clue that what he was doing was wrong. You know, like, it wasn't what was appropriate. And I said, if you don't want him to dance in church, then you need to tell him that. How's he supposed to know? He's 3 years old. We dance around the house. You know, we put on Disney music and dance around the house. It was just a natural thing. And so often children get blamed for being naughty when they're just being themselves because they don't know.
That's so important. You're right to appreciate those differences. And you know, I know it myself, having 2 children, one of which is definitely, you know, got certain ways of being already, you know, even at 3 years old, like you said, it's kind of, it becomes quite clear. You know, it's just today, you know, watching a video from nursery of a introverted sensing child, you know, opting out of being in the rowdy guitar music big thing that was going on and going off to play in the corner and do something else, getting away from the stimulation. It was just, you know, very interesting to see that actually happening.
Yeah. And the differences are there really early. I remember seeing a presentation by Elizabeth Murphy years ago where she showed film clips of her grandchildren when they were really tiny, like less than a year old, and then a few years later and a few years later, and the behavior was consistent, you know, sort of, and she was picking up on preferences very, very early. I typed both of my kids before they started school. They were obvious, you know, that, like, when you've got extroverted children, it's often easier to spot what the type is because it's all out there. And it made such a difference, just the fact that I could adjust the way I handled them and the expectations I had to suit their needs and their natural style. And I've got to say, I have an ESFP child who in adolescence did not give me one day of grief. And I think part of that was because I made sure his needs were met. He ended up in a performing arts high school, got a degree in musical theatre, which is not very good for earning an income, but like he you know, he didn't have any reason to misbehave during adolescence because he was doing what he loved doing. And so,
yeah, well, listen, we've better wrap it up now. So we've gone up to the full hour now. So I could sit here and chat about this for a long time. Like, development is the most fascinating aspect of type, and I just hope we can meet at a conference sometime. You know, have a chat and carry it on.
Well, look, I'm happy to do this anytime. I'm in ENFP, and you know, with the world the way it is at the moment, where we're spending more time at home, I'm happy to sit and talk to you for hours if you want. So anytime.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, all the best, and yeah, carry on the work and take care.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.